she was counting pennies. Literally counting them, one by one, her weathered fingers trembling as she tried to gather enough for a single meal. The line at the downtown shelter stretched around the block, filled with faces that had learned to look down, to avoid eye contact, to disappear into themselves. But Margaret couldn't disappear. Not at 73. Not when every coin mattered. Not when the choice was between eating and her heart medication. The woman behind her in line sighed loudly, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Some people, she muttered to her friend, loud enough for everyone to hear, taking forever just to count change. Probably gonna hold up the whole line. Margaret's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept counting. 57 cents, 58. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. A group of teenagers walked by, pointing and laughing. "Look at the old lady," one of them said, pulling out his phone. "Crying over pennies. That's so sad, it's funny." The camera flash went off, and Margaret instinctively covered her face, but the damage was done. Another moment of her dignity stripped away, broadcast to the world for entertainment. The shelter volunteer, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, barely looked up when Margaret finally reached the counter. "Next," she called impatiently, tapping her pen against her clipboard. Margaret opened her small purse, the one she'd carried through 3 tours of duty in Vietnam as a combat nurse, the one that had held letters from home and photos of fallen soldiers. Now it held loose change and expired coupons. I have 58 cents, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the busy street. Is there anything I can get for that?" The volunteer glanced at the posted prices and shook her head without a trace of compassion. "Minimum is $3 for a basic meal." "Next." She looked past Margaret as if she were already gone. That's when the tears came. Not dramatic sobs, but the quiet, broken tears of someone who had given everything and received nothing in return. Margaret stepped aside, clutching her purse, watching as person after person paid for their meals and found tables. She hadn't eaten in 18 hours. Her medication made her dizzy on an empty stomach, but she couldn't afford both food and pills. She found a spot against the brick wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the cold concrete, her knees damaged from carrying wounded soldiers through jungle terrain 5 decades ago, screamed in protest. But physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in her chest, the ache of being invisible, of being forgotten, of being nothing, more than an inconvenience to a world that had moved on without her. People walked past, averting their eyes. Some pulled their children closer, as if her poverty might be contagious. Others pretended to be fascinated by their phones. Anything, to avoid acknowledging the elderly woman crying on the sidewalk. This was America in 2024. This was how heroes were treated when they grew old and their battles became invisible. But one person wasn't looking away. Across the street, leaning against a black pickup truck, a man in his 50s watched Margaret, with the focused attention of someone who recognized something familiar. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, nothing that would make him stand out in a crowd. But his posture, the way he held himself, spoke of discipline and purpose. His name was David Chen, and he'd been watching this scene unfold for the past 10 minutes. He'd seen the way people treated Margaret, heard the cruel comments, witnessed the casual cruelty of a society that had forgotten how to care for its most vulnerable. But the man watching her wasn't just any stranger. If you believe that dignity doesn't disappear with age, that respect should be earned through service and sacrifice, hit that like button right now. Comment honor if you think our veterans deserve better than counting pennies for their next meal. And subscribe, because some stories need to be told, some voices need to be heard, and some heroes need to be remembered before it's too late. Margaret had been 22 when she volunteered for Vietnam, fresh out of nursing school, filled with patriotic fire and a genuine desire to help. She could have stayed home, could have taken a safe job at a civilian hospital, could have avoided the hell that waited for her in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But that wasn't who she was. That had never been who she was. She spent 3 tours in combat zones, working in field hospitals that were little more than tents and prayer. She held the hands of 18-year-old boys as they died thousands of miles from home. She worked 18-hour shifts in 100-degree heat, performing triage on soldiers whose bodies had been torn apart by landmines and mortar shells. She saved lives when saving lives seemed impossible. The shrapnel scar on her left shoulder came from the night the field hospital was hit by enemy fire. Instead of taking cover, Margaret had thrown herself over a wounded soldier, absorbing the metal fragments meant for him. That soldier went home to his family in Ohio. Margaret went to the next hospital, the next batch of wounded, the next impossible day of trying to patch together what war had torn apart. When she finally returned to American soil in 1975, the country she'd served greeted her with protests and spit. Veterans were called baby killers, war criminals, pawns of an immoral system. There were no parades, no thank you ceremonies, no recognition of sacrifice. Just silence and shame and the assumption that anyone who'd served must have done something wrong. Margaret tried to adjust to civilian life, but the skills that kept her alive in Vietnam didn't translate to peacetime America. The hypervigilance that saved lives in combat zones made normal social interactions exhausting. The medical training that allowed her to work miracles with improvised equipment seemed useless in overregulated hospitals with their bureaucracy and politics. She worked various jobs over the decades, none of them paying well enough to build real security. A series of bad investments, a divorce that cost her half of everything, and medical bills from cancer treatment 15 years ago had wiped out what little savings she'd managed to accumulate. Social Security barely covered her rent in a studio apartment in the worst part of town. Her adult children lived in other states, struggling with their own financial problems, unaware of how desperate their mother's situation had become. Margaret had learned to hide her struggles, to smile and say she was fine when anyone asked. Pride, perhaps, or maybe just the ingrained military discipline that taught her to handle problems without complaint. But sitting on that sidewalk, counting pennies while strangers recorded her humiliation for social media entertainment, pride felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. What happened next would restore her faith in humanity forever. David Chen crossed the street with the measured pace of someone who had learned not to rush into situations without understanding them. First, he'd been watching Margaret for several minutes, and something about her posture, the way she held herself even in defeat, had triggered a recognition he couldn't ignore. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, experiences that taught him to read people quickly and accurately. The woman sitting against the wall wasn't just another homeless person asking for handouts. There was something in her bearing, even in her despair, that spoke of discipline and service. The way she kept her back straight despite the obvious pain. The careful way she organized the contents of her purse. The quiet dignity with which she accepted her situation without anger or blame. David had done well for himself after leaving the military. A combination of the GI Bill, VA benefits, and smart financial decisions had allowed him to build a successful landscaping business. He employed 12 people, most of them veterans who struggled to find work in the civilian world. He understood how easy it was for service members to fall through the cracks, to discover that the skills that made them heroes in combat zones made them unemployable in corporate America. His own transition hadn't been smooth. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the inability to connect with people who hadn't shared his experiences. He'd been lucky to find mentors, lucky to access resources, lucky to have family support during the darkest periods. But luck wasn't equally distributed, and he'd seen too many good people destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Approaching Margaret required careful consideration. Veterans, especially those who'd been failed by the system, often viewed offers of help with suspicion. Too many promises had been broken. Too many programs had fallen short. Too many people had offered assistance only to disappear when the help was actually needed. David knelt down beside Margaret, positioning himself at her eye level rather than looming over her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying the respectful tone he'd learned in military training. "I couldn't help but notice you might be having a tough day. I'm wondering if I could help you get something to eat." Margaret looked up, her eyes red from crying, but still sharp with intelligence. She studied David's face, looking for the condescension or pity she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, she found genuine concern and something else, recognition, perhaps. The look of someone who understood battles that couldn't be seen. "I don't need charity," Margaret said automatically, the response she'd given countless times to well-meaning strangers. But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. She did need help. She needed it desperately, and pretending otherwise wasn't going to change her situation. David nodded, understanding the complexity of pride and necessity. "I respect that, ma'am. But I was wondering if you might do me a favor instead. I was about to buy food for everyone in this shelter, but I don't know what people actually want. Would you mind helping me figure out what would be most appreciated?" It was a graceful way to offer help without making it feel like charity. Margaret recognized the tactic, had used similar approaches herself when working with proud soldiers who needed medical attention but didn't want to appear weak. The offer allowed her to maintain dignity while accepting assistance, to be helpful rather than helpless. Margaret studied David more carefully, noting details she'd missed in her initial assessment. The way he carried himself, the precise way he spoke, the respectful distance he maintained while still engaging directly. "You served," she said. It wasn't a question. David smiled, the first genuine expression Margaret had seen from anyone all day. "Afghanistan, 2 tours as a combat medic. And you?" "Vietnam, 3 tours, combat nurse." The words came out automatically, but saying them aloud felt strange after years of keeping her service history private. Most people either didn't care or viewed her service negatively, so she'd learned to avoid the subject entirely. But David's expression changed immediately, his casual respectfulness shifting into something deeper. Vietnam veterans held a special place in the military community, their sacrifice recognized by younger generations, even when civilian society continued to ignore them. "Thank you for your service, ma'am," David said, and the words carried weight, beyond mere politeness. Standing up, David extended his hand to help Margaret to her feet. "Come on, let's go take care of everyone inside. I have a feeling you know exactly what people need most." But his gesture was just the beginning. Inside the shelter, David approached the same volunteer who had dismissed Margaret minutes earlier. The transformation in the woman's attitude was immediate and dramatic when David pulled out his credit card and said, "I'd like to pay for meals for everyone here today. Whatever they want, whatever they need." The volunteer's eyes widened. "Everyone?" "Sir, we have about 60 people in line, and meals range from $3 to $12 depending on what they order." She was clearly calculating the potential cost, wondering if this stranger understood what he was offering. "Everyone," David confirmed. "And not just basic meals. I want people to be able to order whatever looks good to them. Add 20%. Tip for your staff too." He handed over his card without hesitation, as if buying meals for 60 strangers was something he did every Tuesday afternoon. Word spread quickly through the line. People who had been resigned to their cheapest options suddenly found themselves able to choose freely. Families who had been splitting single meals among multiple people could each order their own food. Children who had learned not to ask for dessert could finally have something sweet. Margaret watched the transformation with amazement. Faces that had been closed off and defeated began to open up. People started talking to each other, sharing stories, laughing. The atmosphere in the shelter shifted from desperate survival to something approaching community. But David wasn't finished. He pulled the volunteer aside and spoke quietly, but Margaret was close enough to hear. "What other services does the shelter provide? Do you have programs for job placement, medical care, housing assistance?" The volunteer, still stunned by David's generosity, explained that the shelter offered various support services, but was chronically underfunded. Many programs had waiting lists, and some had been discontinued entirely due to budget constraints. David listened carefully, asking specific questions about costs and needs. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Sarah, it's David. I need you to transfer $10,000 from the business account to..." He looked at the volunteer, who provided the shelter's information with shaking hands. $10,000. Just like that. No paperwork, no approval process, no conditions or requirements. Just a recognition of need and an immediate response. The volunteer actually started crying, explaining that the donation would allow them to restart their job training program and extend their medical clinic hours. Margaret felt tears returning to her eyes, but these were different tears. These were tears of restored faith, of remembered humanity, of the recognition that goodness still existed in the world. She'd spent so long feeling invisible, forgotten, worthless. But David's actions reminded her that her assessment of her own value might have been wrong. Other people in the shelter began to notice what was happening. The man who had paid for everyone's meals had also just donated enough money to transform the shelter's ability to help people. Word spread through the line, and soon David found himself surrounded by grateful faces, people wanting to shake his hand, to thank him, to understand why he was doing this. David handled the attention with gracious humility, deflecting praise and focusing on the people around him. He learned names, listened to stories, treated each person as an individual rather than a problem to be solved. Margaret watched him work the room and recognized the leadership skills that had made him effective as a combat medic. But she also recognized something else. The way David kept glancing at her, checking to make sure she was okay, including her in conversations, treating her not as the recipient of charity but as a partner in his mission of helping others. He understood that dignity was as important as food, that respect was as necessary as money. When David finally made his way back to Margaret, he had a proposition. "I've been thinking," he said. "My business could use someone with your background, someone who understands how to work with veterans, how to help people transition back to civilian life. Would you be interested in talking about a job?" Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. "A job?" "Sir, I'm 73 years old. I haven't worked a regular job in over 2 years. Most people wouldn't even consider. Most people don't understand what military experience is worth." David interrupted gently. "They don't understand that someone who could perform emergency surgery in a jungle under enemy fire might have skills that transfer to other situations. They don't understand that someone who spent 3 tours helping soldiers recover from trauma might be exactly what other veterans need." He wasn't offering charity disguised as employment. He was offering genuine work, meaningful work that would use her skills and experience rather than dismissing them as irrelevant. Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The reason he did this will move you to tears. David Chen's generosity wasn't random. It wasn't the impulse of a successful businessman looking for tax deductions or good publicity. It came from a place of deep personal understanding, a debt he felt he owed to the generation of veterans who had paved the way for his own service. 25 years earlier, when David was a 20-year-old soldier struggling with his first deployment to Afghanistan, he had been assigned to work with a Vietnam veteran who served as a civilian contractor. The man's name was Robert Sullivan, and he was exactly Margaret's age now when he took David under his wing. Robert had served 3 tours in Vietnam as a medic, just like Margaret had served as a nurse. He'd come home to a country that spat on him, called him names, treated him like a war criminal rather than a hero. He'd struggled with addiction, homelessness, and the kind of deep depression that comes from serving your country only to be rejected by it. But Robert had fought his way back. He'd gotten clean, found work, built a life. And when the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan began, he volunteered to deploy as a civilian contractor, determined to help the next generation of service members avoid the mistakes he'd made and the traps he'd fallen into. David had been struggling badly during his first deployment. The stress of combat medicine, the weight of making life and death decisions at 20 years old, the guilt that came with saving some lives while losing others. He'd been heading toward the same dark path that claimed so many young veterans. Robert recognized the signs because he'd lived them himself. He spent hours talking with David, sharing strategies for managing stress, teaching him how to compartmentalize trauma, showing him how to maintain humanity in the middle of inhumane situations. More importantly, he taught David that seeking help wasn't weakness, that processing trauma was part of the job, that survival meant more than just making it home alive. Robert saved David's life, though not in any way that would show up in official records. He saved it by preventing David from drowning in guilt and anger and despair. He saved it by showing David that service members could have full, meaningful lives after their military careers ended. He saved it by proving that the brotherhood of veterans extended across generations and conflicts. David never forgot those lessons or that debt. When he returned from his second deployment and began building his business, he looked for Robert, wanting to thank him properly, wanting to pay forward some of what he'd received. But Robert had died 2 years earlier, alone in a VA hospital, his contributions to young soldiers unrecognized and unremembered. That loss had haunted David for years. The recognition that the man who had saved his life, who had made his success possible, had died forgotten and alone. The understanding that Robert's story was repeated thousands of times across the country as Vietnam veterans aged into poverty and invisibility, while the nation they'd served moved on without them. David had made a promise to himself after Robert's funeral. He would never walk past a veteran in need. He would never ignore the struggles of the generation that had endured the worst homecoming in American history. He would never let another Robert Sullivan die alone and forgotten. When David saw Margaret, crying on the sidewalk, counting pennies for a meal, he saw Robert's face. He saw the woman who might have been Robert's counterpart, the combat nurse who had saved lives under fire only to be abandoned by the society she'd served. He saw a chance to pay forward what Robert had given him, to honor a debt that could never be fully repaid. But David also saw an opportunity to break a cycle. Margaret's skills and experience could help current veterans transitioning to civilian life. Her understanding of military culture, combined with her medical background and hard-won wisdom about overcoming adversity, made her uniquely qualified to help other service members avoid the pitfalls that had claimed too many of her generation. The job David offered wasn't charity. It was recognition of value that others had failed to see. Margaret would work as a veterans liaison for his company, helping new employees adjust to civilian work environments, providing counseling and support for those struggling with transition issues, connecting people with resources and opportunities. It was work that mattered, work that would save lives in ways that might not be immediately visible but would be no less real. Every veteran who successfully transitioned to civilian life because of Margaret's help would go on to help others. Every family that stayed together because a veteran got the support they needed would produce children who grew up with stable homes. Every suicide prevented would ripple forward through generations. David understood that healing trauma required more than individual therapy or medication. It required community, purpose, the recognition that pain could be transformed into service. Margaret's suffering hadn't been meaningless if it could be used to prevent others from experiencing the same isolation and despair. As they sat in the shelter, watching 60 people enjoy meals they hadn't been able to afford an hour earlier, David explained his vision to Margaret. A network of veteran-owned businesses that prioritized hiring service members, support systems that recognized military skills as assets rather than liabilities, communities that honored service with more than empty words on Veterans Day. Margaret listened with growing excitement. For the first time in years, she could envision a future that included purpose and meaning rather than just survival. She could see herself helping others navigate challenges she'd faced herself, using her painful experiences as tools for healing rather than just sources of regret. The transformation was already beginning. Other people in the shelter had noticed. Margaret's shift from despair to hope had seen the respect with which David treated her. They began approaching her with questions, seeking advice, recognizing in her the kind of wisdom that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. Margaret found herself counseling a young veteran who'd been struggling with nightmares, sharing strategies she'd developed for managing hypervigilance. She talked with a middle-aged woman who'd been medically discharged from the Army, helping her understand that civilian employers' lack of understanding didn't reflect on her worth as a person. By the end of the afternoon, Margaret had informally counseled 6 different people, connecting them with resources, offering encouragement, providing the kind of peer support that no civilian therapist could replicate. She was doing the work David had envisioned, and it was clear that she was naturally gifted at it. The shelter volunteer approached David as he prepared to leave. "I don't know what you've done here today," she said, "but it's not just about the money. You've changed the whole atmosphere of this place. People are talking to each other, helping each other, acting like a community instead of just a collection of individual problems." David smiled, but he directed her attention to Margaret, who was still deep in conversation with a veteran half her age. "That's not my doing," he said. "That's what happens when you treat people with dignity, when you recognize their value instead of just seeing their needs." Margaret's been ready to help others all along. She just needed someone to believe in her potential rather than focusing on her problems. As David drove Margaret to her apartment that evening, they talked about practical details: start date, salary, training programs, office space. But underneath the logistics was something more important: the restoration of purpose, the transformation of survival into service, the recognition that endings could also be beginnings. Margaret's apartment was a stark reminder of how far she'd fallen. A studio in a building that should have been condemned decades ago, furnished with items rescued from dumpsters and thrift stores. But as she showed David around, pointing out the small improvements she'd made despite her limited resources, he saw resilience rather than poverty. "It's not much," Margaret said apologetically, "but it's home." David looked around the small space, noting the carefully maintained cleanliness, the books stacked neatly on makeshift shelves, the small altar with photos of soldiers she'd served with in Vietnam. "It's perfect for someone who knows how to make the most of limited resources," he said. "But I'm hoping we can improve your situation pretty quickly." The salary David offered was more than Margaret had made at any job in the past decade. Combined with her Social Security, it would allow her to move to a better apartment, to eat regular meals, to stop choosing between food and medication. But more importantly, it would give her something money couldn't buy: the knowledge that her life still had meaning, that her experiences could be transformed into service. 3 months later, Margaret Chen Sullivan stood before a group of newly hired veterans at David's company, sharing her story as part of their orientation program. She'd taken David's last name and Robert's, honoring both the man who'd saved her and the man who'd saved him. Her apartment was in a safe neighborhood now, furnished with comfortable furniture and filled with thank you notes from veterans she'd helped. But the real transformation wasn't in her living situation. It was in her sense of purpose, her understanding of her own worth, her recognition that survival could become service. The woman who had counted pennies for a meal now managed a program that helped hundreds of veterans find meaningful work and supportive community. The shelter where David first saw Margaret had become one of his company's regular volunteer sites. Every month, his employees spent a Saturday working there, serving meals, organizing donations, providing the kind of skilled labor that nonprofit organizations couldn't afford to hire. Margaret coordinated these efforts, bridging the gap between military and civilian volunteers. David's business had grown too, as word spread about a company that genuinely supported veterans rather than just using their military service as a marketing gimmick. Clients wanted to work with businesses that reflected their values, and employees wanted to work for companies that demonstrated real commitment to service. The ripple effects continued to spread. Veterans who found stable employment through Margaret's program went on to help others. Families that stayed together because a veteran got proper support raised children who understood the value of service. Communities that benefited from skilled veteran workers began to see military experience as an asset rather than a liability. Most importantly, Margaret's story began to change how people thought about aging veterans. Speaking engagements led to media coverage, which led to policy discussions, which led to actual changes in how veteran services were funded and delivered. One woman's journey from despair to purpose became a catalyst for systematic improvements that helped thousands of others. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Margaret had learned to see her own story differently, to understand that her struggles hadn't been failures but preparation for a larger mission. The pain of being forgotten had taught her how to recognize others who felt invisible. The experience of counting pennies had given her empathy for people facing impossible choices. The years of isolation had prepared her to build communities of mutual support. Every morning, Margaret woke up with purpose. Every day brought opportunities to transform someone else's despair into hope. Every evening ended with the satisfaction of meaningful work well done. She had discovered that life's most important chapters could begin at any age, that service could take many forms, that dignity could be restored even after it seemed permanently lost. David often reflected on the chain of events that had brought them together. Robert's mentorship had saved his life, which enabled him to build a successful business, which gave him the resources to help Margaret, which allowed her to help countless others. It was a reminder that every act of kindness rippled forward in ways that couldn't be predicted, but were no less real for being invisible. The shelter volunteer who had once dismissed Margaret now greeted her warmly whenever she visited, having learned to see potential where she'd previously seen only problems. The teenagers who had mocked her poverty and posted her picture online had seen the media coverage of her transformation and learned something about the difference between temporary circumstances and permanent worth. Most of the original 60 people who'd been in the shelter that day had moved on to better situations. Some had found jobs, others had secured stable housing, many had reconnected with family members. They carried Margaret's story with them, sharing it with others who needed to hear that change was possible, that dignity could be restored, that society's failures didn't have to become personal defeats. Margaret kept a framed photo on her desk from that first day at the shelter. It showed David kneeling beside her on the sidewalk, offering help with the respect that had been missing from her life for too long. The photo captured a moment of transformation, the instant when despair began its conversion into hope. But the image also captured something larger, the recognition that every person has value, that service takes many forms, that communities are built one relationship at a time. It reminded everyone who saw it that dignity isn't determined by bank account balances, that respect should be earned through character rather than wealth, that the true measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable members. The downtown shelter still served meals to people who couldn't afford them elsewhere. But it also served as a reminder that individual actions could transform entire communities, that kindness was contagious, that the choice to help rather than ignore could ripple forward through generations. Margaret Chen Sullivan had learned that heroes aren't just people who serve in combat zones. They're people who recognize suffering and choose to address it, who see potential where others see problems, who understand that the most important battles are often fought in the quiet moments when no one is watching. Her story had become proof that it's never too late to begin again, that purpose can be found at any age, that the skills developed through surviving adversity can be transformed into tools for helping others. She had discovered that the greatest victory wasn't avoiding defeat, but learning how to transform it into service. And every day, as she helped other veterans navigate their own transitions from military to civilian life, Margaret remembered the lesson that David's kindness had taught her. That dignity is something we give to each other, that respect is something we choose to offer, and that the simple act of treating someone as valuable can literally save their life. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that every person has value regardless of their current circumstances, take a moment to comment below. Share a time when someone's kindness changed your perspective, or tell us about a veteran in your life who deserves recognition. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon against despair is simply the willingness to see each other's worth, and the courage to act on that recognition when it matters most.